Hello, everyone. Welcome to Newspaper Liturgy Live. How you all doing? Hope you're doing well. For those who don't know, a part of this channel, I do this every week called Newspaper Liturgy Live, where I go through a certain news story or a certain theme within the news conversation. And then I also go through something in the Bible, but approach it from a Christian leftist perspective or a progressive Christian perspective, not in a way that's trying to guilt trip you like a lot of other ways, like Christian ways of approaching the news and stuff like that. So, yeah, we just talk about a lot of stuff here. Here's my cool little background stuff here about reading the Bible and reading the newspaper. And if you don't know who I am, I'm Damon. And on this channel, I talk about stuff from a perspective of the Christian left and give you essentials for the future of faith. And I think those conversations are extremely important right now. Everybody's talking about this stuff, aren't they? Even if they're not using the same words, they seem to still be talking about it. And that's why I love also talking about this stuff within the context of ancient religious texts, because it exposes us to the fact that nothing is new under the sun. Like everything we're talking about these days, we're also being talked about throughout all human history. Just different words, different contexts, different people, different faces, different states. We're still struggling for the same stuff. And so today, I want to talk about this idea of white people being late to justice issues. Now, it's not because y'all are white. If you're white and watching this, I'm not one of those guys that thinks if you have white skin, it's because you have or inherently evil when you were born because the color of your skin was paler than the other people. No. But in America, I'm specifically talking about the United States here, which is usually what people are talking about when they talk about things like white privilege. In America, we have centuries and centuries and centuries worth of history of, America's only a couple centuries. Well, I'm counting before that too, which led to the colonizing of America too. We have centuries and centuries worth of white people living certain privileged lives because they were white, because of the heritage they were born in. And other people were looked at as subhuman, different minorities, whether they were because they were from a different heritage or because they were women. So many people, so many other humans did not get to experience the privilege that white people did because they had a philosophy, a theology, and policies that determined them as subhuman, that determined them as second-class citizens. Then, over time, things started to get a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better. And then over the last few decades in America, things have gotten a lot better in terms of policy and larger philosophy. Of course, there's so much racism face to face that happens time to time, but also there's racism within the system. But it's like racism keeps being just adapted to however the society changes. Like people love to talk about how the prison system is like a new Jim Crow, which seems pretty obvious when you see how many people of color are in the prison system. And so what we see is that, and this is kind of touching on what I talked about last week on this rise of white supremacy, what we see is that through things like more anti-discrimination laws, through things like affirmative action stuff, through things like just a change in the way we tell stories, what we have seen is people of color get more opportunities that were formerly only given to white people. And therefore, the great white promise is starting to come apart, is starting to collapse. Young white men who used to get whatever they want because they were white, born today, don't get the privileges that their grandfathers did. Nope. It's like I've heard people explain it, the analogy of like this long line of white people about to receive the great white promise, and then all of a sudden you see people of color cutting in line, and it's like, what? And what's funny is because of that, we can't say things like, oh, yeah, all white people are all rich and privileged and have everything they could ever ask for because they're white. We used to be able to say that for sure. Not today. Things have changed. And the ultimate truth is that it's not the fault of people with white skin or minorities. It's the fault of this larger capitalist system that is screwing everyone over. And people of color even more. But through this injustice, white people are finally starting to feel the negative effects of capitalism, and they start to get frustrated and confused. And then you have white supremacists say, I'll tell you the reason. It's all these brown people, it's all these black people. Do something about it. It's very much a twisting and manipulating of a confusion and frustration that a lot of young white men don't know what to do with right now. But what's funny is from a non-white perspective, they hear people complaining about, oh yeah, things used to be so much better before all these minorities came in, and now we don't receive what we used to. Things aren't as flourishing as they used to be. And it's funny from a non-white perspective because it's like, you realize what you're actually saying is now you have to live like the rest of us. It's so common. We hear it all the time of like upper middle class, privileged people talk about how, I can't believe I have to spend this much on housing. Well, people of color are like, yeah, that's what we've always experienced. I can't believe I have to actually spend this much on health insurance. Yeah, that's what we've always experienced. I can't believe all these job opportunities just keep failing. I can't get a job no matter how hard I try. Yep, that's what we've always been experiencing and always saying. Something that I see often nowadays, it's like a lot of white people are finally jumping onto the bandwagon of saying, yeah, something's wrong with our world today. And it's funny from the person of color's perspective because it's like, yeah, we've been trying to tell you this whole time. A common thing that I see is with the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement. It was interesting because, like, let's say, for example, my parents grew up, and this is like what, the 70s and 80s and some of the 90s, grew up with being discriminated against by police because of what they looked like, or because of the neighborhoods they were from, or because that's just what police do. Like, there was this general idea, of course, police don't like us. And then over time, it's like this Black Lives Matter stuff happened, and people like to say that a reason this was such a huge deal is because we all have cell phones now, and we could record now, and we can record the injustice. And then it made the conversation even bigger for people to finally start talking about it. Another way you can word that is putting this stuff on camera actually allowed white people to see it for the first time. Of course, not all white people. Of course, plenty of white people saw it. But I'm saying plenty of white people who were never, ever seeing this injustice were now able to see it. And now we're like, oh my God, it's real. And people of color were like, yeah, we've been saying this. And you told us to shut up and that we were crazy, or that we were just bitter, or that we were the real racists. And something I've started to see, even on like a much smaller scale, this pattern on a much, much smaller scale in the ex-evangelical world, I've seen, obviously, evangelicalism, just by its very nature, does injustice to people of color by completely dismissing their voices and experience, and ultimately propping up Eurocentric white theology. And people were saying, this isn't right. We need to do something about it. This isn't the right path to be on. I'm leaving. I'm out of this evangelical thing. People of color were experiencing that first. And then later, over time, white people started to feel the injustice, and then they left too. And now something that people are starting to complain about in the ex-evangelical spaces is that so many ex-evangelical platforms, whether ex-evangelical blogs or channels or books or organizations, nonprofits, tend to have a feeling of, hey, we are all just realizing how bad evangelicalism is. And when it says we, it's a generalized we, as if when white people discovered how harmful evangelicalism could be, it suddenly became true. When people of color were like, yeah, we've been saying this. And this is a common thing that happens through every justice issue, is that people are put in power, a system is set in place. Those people do not do things to make sure that they maintain justice within this system of power. And therefore, people start to feel the pain of that injustice. And usually, the first people to feel this pain of injustice are women of color, because they tend to be at the bottom rung of the way that discrimination works. And then they end up trying to speak out and say something about it. And they're told, shut up, or they're told, you don't know what you're talking about, or they're told, you're just bitter, or they're imprisoned or killed at times. Then some more time passes, the injustice continues, therefore, more people start to feel it. And then some men of color start to say something about it. And once again, they're dismissed or imprisoned or killed. And then, of course, the injustice continues. Of course, because nothing's being done about it. The people who are speaking up about it are being told, shut up, or you don't know what you're talking about. Then, of course, eventually, white people feel the injustice because the injustice kept going. And then they speak up. And sometimes this is finally when the system listens. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is when history is told or when news of this is spread, they say things like, these white people are speaking about this injustice. This is like the first time. I mean, it may not be directly said that way, but it's framed that way, as if they just discovered how bad this situation is, completely ignoring all the people before that were trying to speak up about it. And so this is like a normal pattern. And sometimes when not even those people are listened to, that's usually when a system of power collapses, because of course the injustice continues, and of course the injustice reaches them because it reached everyone else at first. What's up, Ricky? I'm glad you're here. Sorry, I have to look at my phone and see the comments. Glad you're here. Now, okay, so I just explained this basic pattern. Now, I'm going to tell you that this pattern has always existed throughout all of ancient history. And Jesus even told a parable about this pattern. You want to hear it? Okay, cool. Mark chapter 12. Now, this is the context of what he's about to say here is in the context of a group of religious teachers. The religious teachers, oh man. In this context, he spoke to, absolutely want to hear it. Thank you, Ricky. In this context, plenty of the oppressed and poor Jewish people that Jesus hung around and taught to also were so glad to have someone like Jesus, because the religious teachers of their day were constantly dismissing their real issues. Were constantly dismissive of them, or told, you don't know what you're talking about, shut up. Or were made to feel guilty about it. How can you be complaining? Why are you so ungrateful? And then Jesus comes along and says, no, I actually see what you're going through. I see you. There's plenty of stories throughout the Gospels of Jesus seeing, like physically seeing people that everyone just walks on by every day, whether it's a crippled man with leprosy that everyone just walks on by and then Jesus is the only one to stop, or a sex worker who is at the feet of Jesus that all the other religious teachers are like, pfft, and Jesus is like, do you see this woman? And so the religious teachers are around Jesus and they're trying to challenge him, tell him he doesn't know what he's talking about, asking him, where do you get authority to say such things? And then he says, then he began to speak to them in parables. Here's the parable. A man planted a vineyard put a fence around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants and went to another country. So dude sets up a system, puts people in charge of it, leaves. When the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants to collect from them his share of the produce of the vineyard. But they seized him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And again, he sent another slave to them. This one they beat over the head and insulted. Then he sent another, and that one they killed. And so it was with many others. Some they beat, and others they killed. He had still one other, a beloved son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But those tenants said to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they seized him, killed him, and threw him out of the vineyard. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read this scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and this was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. And then it says, when the teachers, when they realized he had told this parable against them, they wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowd, so they left him and went away, only to later figure out another way to arrest him and kill him. Now, why are the religious teachers so offended at this point? Because he's making a point about prophets. Jesus is a part of a long line of prophets who recognized Israel's original calling by God to be a tribe that blesses all the other tribe, a nation that blesses all the other nations, and exists to maintain justice and righteousness and take special care of the poor and the oppressed. When they don't do that, in the Old Testament stories, there's plenty of stories of God then sending a prophet to the people to tell them, hey, remember our original calling. Remember, we're supposed to maintain justice and righteousness. Remember, we're supposed to take care of the poor and the oppressed. And so often in these Old Testament stories, the person who says that is told to shut up, you don't know what you're talking about, or beaten and killed. So often there's stories throughout the Old Testament of prophets being killed. And Jesus ends up saying pretty much the same stuff. Like, hey, remember who we are supposed to be. And they kill him too. And there's this pattern, once again, where a system is set in place. People feel the pain. A prophet is sent. A prophet is simply just a messenger, a speaker. It's like there's this pattern in the Bible of the people cry out, the cry of the oppressed. Then God hears the cry, and then God tells someone to send a message, to be a voice for the cry of the oppressed. But that may seem like too supernatural to you, like this idea of God hearing something and then God telling someone else. But we all experience this, whether you believe in this supernatural or not. We are all inspired to actually speak up for things that matter. So often we see an injustice and we feel, oh my God, somebody needs to do something about this or say something about this. And then a few thoughts later, you start to wonder, is that someone supposed to be me? And maybe you actually do something or say something. From an ancient perspective, this moment was viewed as a person listening to God who is trying to find voices to speak up for the oppressed. That is how it was always viewed. When someone spoke up for the poor and the oppressed, it was viewed as someone who listened to God. And so Jesus talks about how a prophet is sent to speak up for the poor and the oppressed, and then they were dismissed or killed. Another prophet comes, they were killed. Another prophet comes, they were killed. And to the point where God says, I'll send my beloved son. They'll surely listen to him. This person is way more reputable. This person is even above the ranks of these tenants. Of course they'll listen to him, right? And I view this the same way of injustice happens. Women of color speak up, are dismissed. Men of color speak up, are dismissed. White people speak up, are dismissed. Or they're listened to. And what we see in this way that Jesus frames it, when the person who is highest within the society actually starts to also feel the pain of injustice, and they try to speak up too, and they are ignored, the system collapses. Either through someone else coming along and taking them out because there's such a weak and unstable society that they can't fight back, or through the people rising up against the people in power, against the tenants, the taking power away from the people who are not using the power justly. And that's why it says here, like, he will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others, and then someone else will be given the responsibility of power. And hopefully they are able to maintain justice and righteousness. And if they don't, then the same thing will happen. That's the pattern revealed throughout all the prophetic elements in the Bible. That if someone receives power, they need to use it wisely in order to maintain justice and take care of the poor and the oppressed. If they don't, if they refuse to listen to all the warnings and continue to act unjustly, then they fall apart. Then the empire falls apart. The empire falls. The empire is destroyed. The people in power are destroyed, and power is given to someone else. That's like the pattern here. So even like when we get to Revelation and it talks about how the rulers of the nations will be taken off their thrones and stuff like that, people read that as if like it was like a prophecy said 2,000 years ago that was leading to something maybe like 3,000 or 4,000 years later, when they were talking about their very real situation of the Empire of Rome. And it happened. The Roman Empire fell, just as they said. But it's prophecy, not because it happened back then, but because it always happens. It's a pattern that continues. And so it happens with every empire. That's why Martin Luther King Jr. said things like, if America continues its unjust ways, its racism, America will go to hell. And that's even what the hell language in the Bible, which is actually only in the New Testament, nothing in the Old Testament, is even there for. A way of warning people who continue to act unjustly in the face of the warnings given to them by the people they're acting unjustly toward. That you're going to end up in as some people would word it, the garbage dump of history. Your lineage or your legacy or what you stand for will be destroyed. That's what we're talking about here. This is a pattern that exists today and has historical lineage. And so I see this so often where people feel like, oh, I'm feeling this injustice for the first time. I got to speak up about it. When you do speak up about it, realize that this injustice has always been being felt by people who do not have as much privilege as you, of course. If you're in a privileged position, any complaint you have about society, you can find the less privileged people saying it way before you ever thought of it. That's how it works. And from a spiritual perspective, the goal in life is to actually listen to the voices that speak out against injustice, that actually try to be a voice for the people who are suffering. Not to dismiss them and say, you don't know what you're talking about. I look at society. You're saying that things are unjust. What about all these people? They seem fine. Of course, what happens is when they say that, it keeps going until eventually they can't say, they all seem fine. We have to be willing to listen to people even then, even when we ourselves can't see the suffering around people personally around us. We have to be able to say, okay, I hear you. I see you. Let's do something about it. That to me is what Jesus' calling is when he says this parable to these teachers, saying, hey, we have a long lineage of you guys not listening to people who are trying to be a voice of the oppressed. And that's what I am too. And you're probably going to kill me too. And then they did. And then he starts this movement of a whole large group of seers, a whole large group of prophets, a whole large group of people who are willing to speak up for the oppressed, to stand in the face of power and do something about the injustice they see all around them. That's what it is. That's why I'm like a Christian, That's why I'm still very, very passionate about Jesus. That's why I when I hear the word Christianity, or when I say, let's say that when I say the word Christianity, this is the kind of stuff I'm talking about. And I last week put up 2 videos kind of going into some depth of what were the first Christian churches talking about when they did Christianity, and what is the stream ever since then that I'm a part of. And it's this movement of anti-imperialism in the name of love. So there you go. And anybody in here got anything to say? I feel like I said everything that I wanted to say. I said all this stuff. Mark 12, by the way, if you wanted to see that for yourself. And yeah, it feels good. Been feeling really good. If you got all the way to this point, thank you for watching. Even if you're watching on the replay, thank you so much for watching this. I appreciate you all. If you want to support me, check me out at patreon.com/Damon Garcia. I greatly would appreciate your support, not because I need the money, but also because the more support I get, the more I'll be able to create stuff like this for you all. And I love this stuff. This is perhaps the only thing I'm good at, is this kind of stuff. And Ricky said, just listening to read and come back later. Thank you. Thank you, Ricky. I appreciate you. Appreciate you so much. And I appreciate you all for watching this. So I'll see you later. See you in the next newspaper liturgy. And I'll see you in the next videos that are going to be coming out this week. Thank you so much. Appreciate you all. Bye-bye.